I'm Dr. Mark Hyman, and I'm the director of the Cleveland Clinic Center for Functional Medicine. Welcome, everybody, to Drawdown, Changing the Food System to Save the Planet. I think we should also add how we can change the food system to save the humans, because we also are at risk given the food system we have. And we're facing a really invisible threat that is really affecting many things, including our human, social, natural, and economic capital, which are all at risk given our current food system. Turns out our food system is the single biggest cause and potentially the single biggest solution to many of our global problems, including chronic disease, economic sustainability, environmental degradation, climate change, and even social justice. It faces all of us, regardless of nationality, race, gender, political persuasion, or dietary beliefs, which can be as divisive often as religion and politics. Turns out food in our food system is the biggest cause of this threat and also, turns out, the most important solution. So I want you to take a minute just to digest these facts, and the pun is intended. We have a food system that kills 11 million people every year around the world from diet-related diseases, and I would think it's actually more. That's an underestimate. It's really related to the high consumption of ultra-processed foods that's poor in whole foods and fruits and vegetables. 800 million people go to bed hungry every night in the world. 2 billion go to bed malnourished, and 2.1 billion go to bed overweight. Most developing nations face a double burden of obesity and malnutrition. In fact, 80% of the world's diabetics are in the developing world. Yet, we waste almost 40% of the food we produce, some estimate higher, driving both hunger and malnutrition while contributing to 8% of the anthropogenic greenhouse gases. And if food waste were a country, and I stole this from Paul, it would be the third largest emitter of greenhouse gases after the United States and China, and James will tell us more about that. So how we do this is creating staggering costs. In the United States alone, over the next 35 years, chronic disease, both direct and indirect costs, will cost $95 trillion, that's with a T, trillion dollars, over $3 trillion a year over the next 35 years, which is almost entirely preventable. The World Economic Forum considers chronic lifestyle preventable diseases the single biggest threat to economic development. So how we grow our food, which currently is mostly through extractive agriculture and intensive use of monocropping, tilling, fertilizers, irrigation, pesticides, herbicides, and practices that cause soil erosion, has far-reaching unsustainable consequences, including loss of half of the biodiversity on the planet. Now, over the last 150 years, we've lost about a third of our topsoil, which, by the way, took billions of years to create. In the Midwest, in the U.S., we had 10 feet of rich topsoil. Then we killed off the bison, which created it. There were 60 million bison, about 10 million elk, roaming the Midwest and creating all this topsoil. And it normally takes about 1,000 years just to build up 3 centimeters of topsoil. So it takes a while. UN experts have estimated that in 60 years, using the current methods of agriculture, we will run out of soil. No soil, no food, no humans. Now, soil and organic rich in organic matter is the rainforest of the prairies. It is able to hold massive amounts of water, preventing droughts and floods and fires, and CO2. And any 1% increase in organic matter in the soil results in the ability to hold 25,000 gallons of water per acre. Soil rich in organic matter, turns out, is the second largest carbon sink in the world after the oceans. Now, according to Project Drawdown, regenerative soil practices, growing plants and animals at scale, can draw down over 40 gigatons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere by 2050. We also have a water crisis. 5% of the water on the earth is fresh water. 70% is used for agriculture, most of it for factory-farmed animals. And you'll hear more about that from David from Impossible Foods. In the United States alone, we deplete our biggest aquifer, which is the Oglala Aquifer in the Midwest, by 1.3 trillion gallons faster per year than we replenish it by rainfall. Then there's the use of nitrogen-based fertilizers, which destroy our soils, rivers, lakes, and oceans. It's both growing corn and soy for feedlot animals and conventionally raised monocrop grains and vegetables. Runoff from the great agricultural basin in the Midwest has left a dead zone the size of New Jersey and the Gulf of Mexico, killing 212,000 metric tons of fish every year. There's another 400 similar dead zones around the world, and it's estimated that nitrogen pollution alone costs $200 billion a year to deal with across the world. So these problems face all of us, wherever we live, whoever we are. Our current agriculture and food system is at the root of the problem, but reimagining our food system is also the biggest solution. Unfortunately, sometimes there's often enthusiastic disagreement about the science and the solutions, but some suggest that the only solution is to reduce meat consumption by 90% or more, which has recently been recommended by the Eat Lancet Commission. Others suggest that the only way to restore the planet's biggest carbon sink, our soil, and to reduce the use of fertilizers, pesticides, and herbicides and restore lost productivity and biodiversity is to expand regenerative agriculture and manage grazing. But the debate should not distract us from working together to solve these critical issues. The solutions must come from all sectors of society, and today's panelists offer diverse ideas for how to save the humans and the planet. We all want the same thing: healthy, thriving humans and a healthy, thriving planet. I encourage us all to listen deeply, to learn, and to keep an open mind, but as Groucho Marx once said, not so open that your brains fall out. Okay, so we have a great group of panelists today. David Lee is CFO of Impossible Foods, an extraordinary company that's trying to bring plant-based proteins into the market and help solve the problem of factory farming of animals. We have Paul Hawken, who started the first natural food store in the country in the 60s and has recently been leading Project Drawdown, which is how we can reverse global warming using the top solutions that exist. We have James Apeel, who's running Apeel, which is Apeel Sciences, which is, like it sounds, it creates a new peel for produce that allows it to last longer and reduce food waste. And we have Nicolette Niman, who's a vegetarian livestock rancher, environmental lawyer, and extraordinary lady. I don't know how you be a vegetarian livestock rancher, but I guess we'll hear about that. So let's start with you, Paul. To set the stage, since the title of the talk is called Drawdown. You published a book in 2017 called Drawdown, the most comprehensive plan ever proposed to reverse global warming. In fact, it was the only plan, which was why it was the most comprehensive plan. Mapping out the biggest levers in energy and food, land use, agriculture, transportation, women's rights, materials, and lots more. You brought together 70 scientists from 22 countries and a 120-member advisory board. You scoured the world's scientific literature, and you applied rigorous peer-reviewed and mathematical models to assess the best ways to draw down carbon in the environment. You found that 8 of the top 20 solutions to solving our climate crisis were food, and collectively that food solutions were the #1 solution to climate change. So first, tell us about the methodology you used to create these conclusions, and then unpack what these food solutions are. What are the solutions, and what are the most important, and why?
Thank you. I was wondering after the introduction whether you all just wanted to leave the room and be depressed.
We're here to fix the problem. That's why.
It's like, that was a really good litany. It's just about included everything. My slides are backwards, so I don't know if you're seeing the slide, but anyway, it's up. They're backwards in order. But the drawdown started in 2001 when 2 things happened. One, the third assessment from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change came out, and as all assessments are more pessimistic than the prior one because it's so-called consensus science, and there's no such thing as consensus science. And science is evidentiary. And so consensus meant it got tamped down by the Saudis and by Venezuela and by China and Russia and so forth. It's like, well, you can't say that in this report or we can't publish it. So every time as an environmentalist you read the IPCC, you kind of have to parse it and think, what do they really mean and what's really going on? And at that time, then 9/11 happened, and I felt just shocked by it. I think we all did. But what I didn't know is it was the world had changed, but how had it changed? And it was not knowable. And I remember where I was, like at Stuart Brand's office, and I was thinking, what do I do for the rest of my life? And I decided that the only thing that made sense is to be helpful. In other words, if it wasn't helpful, don't do it. And if it's helpful, do it. And at that time, I began to go around to NGOs and academic institutions and ask them, what can we do about global warming? And first of all, name the goal, which is drawdown. Can we just name it? Because no one had named the goal, which is to reverse it. Mitigation is not a goal, by the way. It just means reduce the pain of something, and I didn't see that as very interesting. And combating isn't a goal. Fighting isn't a goal. A crusade isn't a goal. I mean, all these words and verbs that are being used around climate were just, to me, both weak and actually violent. About a beautiful system called climate, the atmosphere and weather, just extraordinary. So to do this, could we just map, measure, and model the 100 most substantive solutions to reversing global warming and figure out where do we stand? Is it possible? Is it game over? Do we know where we are? What would it cost? Is it just unaffordable? No one knew at that time. And for those who are climate freaks like me, in the fifth assessment, which came out 5 years ago, there's a third working group, and the third working group is the solutions group. The paper is longer than War and Peace. It's 2,000 pages. And I've asked somebody, because we have lead authors from the IPCC on our advisory board, and I said, have you read it? I said, no, I haven't read it. And said, do you know somebody who's read it? I said, no, let me think. And I've never found anybody in the world who's read the third working group assessment, except the copy editors. I asked them, and they said, oh, we split it up. It's too long and boring. And so that was what the IPCC came up with, And so it was in 2013, because nobody wanted to do it, and they said, you should do it. I said, I don't know how to do it. And so in 2013, when Bill McKibben came out with his famous piece, which is Global Warming's Terrifying Math, Terrifying New Math, that was based on Mark Campanelli's work, who basically took the reserves of coal, gas, and oil and then combusted them, and said it's Venus. We can't. It's doom. And people read it and came to me and said it's game over. And they just were so crestfallen and defeated and despairing. And that's when I decided to do Project Drawdown. And the important point about that was to not do it as a person, but as a collaboration, to gather researchers and people from all over the world, diverse men and women, 21 countries, and to come together and do measure, map, and model the most substantive solutions. And what we noticed is all of us had biases about what was going to be the top 5, the top 10. I mean, I could have put them down and I would have been right.
Yeah.
I knew it. I was dead wrong. And so the methodology was set up to forfend against bias, which we all have about what we believe, what we think, what's true, and all that sort of stuff. So when we came out and pushed the total button, we were shocked. The number one solution is refrigerant management, which was a PR disaster from my point of view, like who cares? And that was the number one solution. But 8 of the top 20 solutions were food related, which again was a surprise. And
Can we show that slide?
Yeah, let's show the slide. I think it's the last slide. I don't have a clicker there.
No, they'll think.
I know, there they are, okay. So there is 8 of the top 20 solutions, and many of them people don't even know about, which is silver pasture. I mean, but the number 3, which is reduce food waste, and we do waste 40% at least of our food in the United States. There's no question about that. And we do it on the farm. We do it at the supermarket. We do it at our restaurant. It's sort of, in a sense, like push the plate away is very classy. It is very unclassy, by the way, because it dishonors all the people and the energy and the work that went into that food. And then we go home and we put it in our refrigerator where food goes to die. And so we do it ourselves, in different ways, but it is extraordinary. Its impact is number 3 solution without counting methane emissions from landfilled food, which is in an anaerobic environment because we couldn't get the data. So it's even higher, but it went away from the list. And this is the number 4 solution, which is plant-rich diet. And plant-rich diet does not mean vegan, vegetarian, or omnivore. It means whatever you want to do. But it does mean reducing your protein intake to 50 grams a day, which is a healthy level. You're a doctor. You can back me up on this. And instead of 90 grams or 100
That's how
grams.
old you are.
I know, yeah. Okay, don't back me up. But the point being is that's what doctors say. But it means also move it to the plant side. It's the Michael Pollan diet, right? Eat food, not too much, mostly plants. And that's really what the plant-rich diet is. And that's the number 4 solution. And then silver pasture, grazing cattle with trees and grass. So do it in like an orchard or different sort of situations. Extraordinary. It's only a 4,000-year-old solution. It's been around forever. And then we can talk about the rest of them as others talk. But I'm just saying is that food is the biggest cause, but it's the biggest solution. Why? Because it's a twofer. It's the only one you can shut off things and say, okay, I'm glad we're not doing that anymore, combusting coal. That's a solution for sure. But food has the capacity to not only stop emitting methane CO2, nitrous oxide, the big three, in terms of greenhouse gases, but to reverse that process through regenerative agriculture to sequester carbon. And there's only two things we can do about the atmosphere, which is to stop putting our greenhouse gases up there and bring them back home, because that's where they came from. Because all gas, coal, and oil is ancient sunlight. That's all it is, from basically photosynthesis that got buried underground. Somebody today, I was in the Navajo Nation, said, "What's your definition of clean coal?" And I said, "Coal that's deeply buried in the ground."
That's great, Paul. Thank you. You mentioned food waste being the number one food solution. Mm-hmm. The Sustainable Development Goals has said that cutting food waste should be one of the priorities, cutting it in half by 2030. James, you've created a company that's focused on solving the problem of food waste. So can you define the problem for us? How big a problem is this, and what are the causes? Paul hinted at it, but can you just kind of unpack a little bit for us?
Yeah, the short answer is the problem's enormous. It's measured in the trillions. Estimates are about 2.6 trillion. The number that's widely cited is
dollars.
2.6 trillion dollars with a T. And the numbers that are widely cited are somewhere between a third and a half of what we grow ultimately ends up in a landfill. And the tragedy of that is exactly as you pointed out, that all of the upstream effort that needs to go into producing that food when it ends up in a landfill is ultimately wasted. And you also miss the opportunity to do the exact double counting that Paul's referring to, which is at the same time you're sequestering carbon dioxide, you're simultaneously producing food. But the challenge of food waste is particularly difficult to get your arms around because of how massive the food system is. Our food system today, basically, as assembled, is so if we dive into this, 40% waste number that people throw around, if you start zooming in on that, you find that a significant but relatively marginal contribution to food loss happens during transportation and storage. Now, it's significant because of the size of the food system, but it's marginal compared to every other part of the supply chain. When you get to a retail store shelf, those losses relative to transportation and storage, about 3 or 4 times greater, right, as soon as the fruit is in the grocery store. And then by far, the largest fraction of those losses are happening on people's countertops at home. And I loved what Paul said earlier about the refrigerators where the food goes to die, because if you zoom in and you start to ask questions about why do our losses magnify as we get closer and closer to our countertops at home. If you look at what's happening during transportation and storage, the reason that we're able to minimize those losses is because we can very precisely control the storage conditions of that produce during that portion of the supply chain. And those optimal storage conditions are effectively a cold, wet box. Now, the cooler you bring the temperature, the slower those metabolic processes are happening inside the food, and so the food's able to age more slowly. And then the high humidity environment reduces basically the driving force for that fruit to dry out, and that desiccation is really what's driving the first hurdle of quality loss in food. And so the way, again, that we've solved this is now...
Before you go to the solution, help people understand the way in which the entire supply chain is affected by the food waste. In other words, all the inputs that go into getting the food to your table and the economic impact of that. Because I don't think people understand from all the seed to the fork what happens.
Yeah, I mean, just to quote some, I think, pretty widely understood numbers. Estimates are 70 to 80% of fresh water going towards irrigation. About a third of our overall energy production on the planet going towards agriculture. As a result, about 25% of our greenhouse gas emissions, about 5 billion pounds of pesticides added to the soil every year. and then at the end of the day, to roughly throw away half of what we're producing.
And the labor and transportation.
Not to
all of that.
mention,
Yeah.
any of the additional.
I mean, you said on your website, it was pretty striking to me that we basically throw away food that would be grown in the entire cropland of China. It's the size of China every year. In other words, if you grew food on every inch of China, that's how much food we throw away every year.
Yeah, when you talk about feeding a growing population, if we could simply get the food that we're growing today into people's mouths, we would have more than enough food to feed that population.
And it's different in the developing world, right? Or the low and middle income countries have different problems. We throw away a lot at the
Somewhere between a third and a half. In certain developing countries, places like Kenya and Nigeria, those losses have been measured to be 80 to 90% of production. And the reason for that, going back to our example here, the way that we're able to get to this 40% loss in quote unquote developed countries is because we have this tool called refrigeration.
Yeah.
And that whether or not you have access to refrigeration basically determines whether you can participate in today's food system. If you go to somewhere like Kenya or Nigeria, you don't have the ability to control the conditions of storage of that produce because the government's largely not provided the infrastructure necessary for the roads, for the electricity grids, for the capital equipment necessary to do that refrigeration, which gives you that 4x extension in the shelf life of the produce.
In developed countries, 35% of the food gets wasted in the kitchen of people's homes, and almost zero in the developing low and middle countries, right?
That's right. Yeah, the portion of the supply chain where these losses occur is shifted dramatically upstream in places of the world that don't have access to the cold chain infrastructure that we're so fortunate to enjoy here.
I could
in
interrupt
some
and say,
places.
poor people don't waste food; they lose food.
Yeah.
There's a real difference.
Yeah.
Yes.
So there's no cold chains.
So you looked at this problem and you were up at night trying to figure it out, and you came up with this fascinating technology, which isn't actually a new technology. It's billions of years old.
Yeah, so Apeel uses so Apeel looked at this and asked the question, okay, well, why does a strawberry last a couple days and a lemon lasts for a month? And coming at this from a materials science perspective, which is what I did my degree in, the question came around down to, well, if the things that are causing produce to go bad are water evaporating out of the surface of the produce and oxygen getting into the produce, that seems like a diffusion problem. And perhaps the lemon has a better protective barrier than the strawberry does. And so we set about to look at this. And it turns out if you zoom in on the surface of a strawberry and the surface of a lemon, those surfaces are made out of the exact same materials, down to the molecule. The difference is the way that those molecules are arranged on the surface of a lemon is different than the way that those molecules are arranged on the surface of a strawberry. And so what Apeel does is take these materials that are found in every bite of fruit and vegetable that you eat every single day, to create these water-based formulas that we dip fresh produce into. We allow it to dry, and when it dries, it leaves behind this little extra peel. You can't see it, you can't taste it, you can't feel it, but by precisely controlling the combinations of materials that we apply to the surface, we can slow down the rate that water evaporates out of the produce relative to the rate that oxygen gets in, and the result is the strawberry behaves much more like a lemon.
Do you have your video?
Yeah. If we can
Oh,
cue
you gotta
that.
show the video.
It's one thing to describe it. It's another to kind of see it in action. So on the left are untreated avocados. This is the first product that we released to the market. See the asparagus still growing on the top right corner. We've now had the ability to sea freight asparagus into the country instead of air freighting it. If you can imagine the cost savings. I love the citrus example. The name of our company, Apeel, comes from the idea that fruit with a peel, longer shelf life than fruit without a peel. You maybe have not seen these before. These are caviar limes. They only last 5 to 7 days. With the technology, we can get them to be about 25 days. Blueberries, this has happened in everyone's refrigerator, shrivel. And then strawberries, this everyone's seen before, very visual. What happens with the strawberry is once you lose about 6% of the mass of a strawberry, you open these little cracks, and then bacteria and fungi get in. So just by maintaining the moisture content inside the fruit, you get these antifungal benefits. This works across categories. Every single surface of a plant that grows above the surface of the earth is covered by a thin polymeric layer called cutin. Some plants are blessed with a hardier protective barrier like a lemon. Some like a strawberry don't benefit from that same protective coating, and so Apeel exists really to borrow from the strong and to provide to the weak in the food system, which allows us to reduce post-harvest losses, so that we can make sure that the food that our planet is growing naturally without us doing anything is able to get to the people who need to consume that.
Have you thought of going into skincare?
Yeah, somebody asked the other day, can I put this in my face?
That's probably the most common question that I get asked, actually.
That'd be a $1 trillion business. Thank you. How scalable is this?
Extremely scalable, and that's what's really, really cool about this. When I talk about the opportunity for Apeel in places of the world that don't have access to this refrigerated supply chain, the ability to distribute these powder materials in little sachets, look like sugar packets, mixed with water, right on a farm, dip your piece of fruit into there, and now it lasts 10, 12 days longer. That will enable a more participatory food system, so that this natural resource, which is fresh fruits and vegetables, which is naturally equitably distributed, people can start capturing some of the economic value associated with that production.
What are the challenges of getting this to every farm in the world?
Exactly like you said. The challenge really is in if I talk about the opportunities for this technology, obviously food waste is an issue here, food waste is an issue in developing countries, but the challenges that you're facing are different. In developed countries, the opportunity is really, as we talked about, further on in the supply chain. How are we helping grocers reduce their waste? How are we bringing these benefits into people's homes? The challenge is reversed in developing countries, where you're really talking about bringing access to the technology onto the farm level, because those are the people who don't have access to the cold chain infrastructure. And so you're talking about addressing two very different market segments. From a commercial perspective, in the U.S., really working directly with grocers to bring this benefit, but you're flipping that, and you're bringing a solution to people who generally have a low willingness to pay, not a whole lot of education, and speaking to a group of farmers in developing countries. And so it crosses the spectrum of challenges.
I think it's important to understand that 70+% of all the food in the world is produced by smallholders.
Yep.
And
70%. And
it's
so
the most geographically distributed.
Right.
And so on the one side, you've got the concentration of the conventional food system like we have today, where there's a major commercial opportunity for our company to go work with those large producers, use the technology to service huge quantities of food right off the bat. But exactly right. It's that long tail, those 70% of people who are managing 1 to 5 hectares of production, who today are not able to capture the economic value associated with what they're growing. Because the joke I like to use, which is quite sad, is the question of philosophy: if a tree falls in the woods and no one's there to hear it, does it make a sound? If a mango grows on a smallholder farm in a region of the world that doesn't have access to the refrigerated supply chain, did it even grow?
I thought it was if the tree fell and nobody heard it, is the man still wrong?
All right. Well, thank you, James. That was really quite enlightening. So, David, your CEO has said that we need a solution to the catastrophic impact of the use of our animals as a food technology, that we can solve it by creating better, more nutritious, delicious products than we get from animals, that we don't need to change people's behavior by telling them it's good for the planet or good for your health, because We do it by making better products. Many companies and investors are getting in this space, and plant-based proteins, including Beyond Meat, and Tyson Foods just sold its shares in Beyond Meat. It looks like they're going to do their own thing, which is interesting in terms of the big food companies doing this in their space. You created Impossible Foods together with Pat Brown, which is a plant-based meat substitute to solve the problem. So can you explain to us how Impossible Foods aims to solve our health, environmental, and climate crises?
Yeah, I think there are two really big important points that started even when Pat started the company nearly 8 years ago. The first, which I think we all get, although it's so gratifying to be at a Milken event where there isn't denial about the magnitude of the problem. It's nice that this group recognizes it. But to be clear, it's such an enormous problem that we need to be doing everything on this list. And frankly, we need massive game-changing technology to have a shot at really reducing the impact that we have on the world. And we think we can. So these incremental ideas, the small ideas that are important and wonderful, can't come at the expense of the ground-shaking big ones, given the enormity of the problem. The second thing that Pat realized along with the company is that this is an emotional problem. This isn't a rational choice. Even if everyone in the world fully understood everything we discussed today, we are in love with our food, and we're in love, in particular, we meat eaters, of which I'm one, we're in love with our meat. In fact, oftentimes when we're in big groups, we ask people to raise hands to identify themselves. Are you a vegan? Are you a vegetarian? Are you a carnivore? Are you a flexitarian? It's interesting to watch. People either tepidly raise their hand, embarrassed, or their hand shoots up, demanding to be noticed because they identify with the food they eat. They have a love affair with meat if they're meat eaters. So even at the outset, Pat started Impossible Foods recognizing this enormous problem will never get fixed unless meat eaters crave something that's better, desire it. And the fact that it also has to be better for the world and better for your health, well, that's just a requirement to make the mission work. And so a lot of what we've worked on is to really focus on the marketplace solution that you see with this Impossible Burger. So I don't know if you all saw, today was a great example. Burger King, in their quarterly earnings release, announced this morning that they're going to be serving the Impossible Whopper across all 7,300 locations by the end of the year. It's the Impossible Whopper, the center of their plate, because it serves their core meat eater. And if you were to look at the 7,000 locations we're served in every state in the US and the several hundred in Asia, you'll find that 90% of our hardcore consumers are carnivores. And it's because we don't tell them that they're ending the world or they're damaging their health. It's because we tell them to try a craveable, delicious burger that they can feel great about. Pat and his team, I think we do 100 prototypes a week. Our bet is that technology is required to change the game, that you can't be local and organic and precious and expensive, that you have to be accessible, better tasting, better for the world, better for your health, and cheaper at scale. Because this is an emotional choice for a north of a $1.5 trillion industry. We're not going to have the impact by betting on regulation or hoping that people come to their senses. So that at a high level, that's been our approach.
So the methodology of the product is fascinating, and how you create the meat-like flavor, which is through a plant-based heme, like in hemoglobin, which is in meat. And there's been some controversy about that, but could you share, what the technology is, and should or shouldn't we be concerned about it?
Well, one important aspect of Impossible Foods is when Pat began his work with some of the top scientists, I think, in the world, he didn't want to understand how to find little flavors that mimicked meat. He wanted to understand, why does meat perform as meat does? Why does it start soft, and in the case of red meat, red? What makes it firm up? What causes the sizzle and the smell? Because he knew that if he couldn't attract that emotional response to meat, that the pace of adoption would be slow. And one of the things we do talk about a lot, though Pat and the team discovered a lot more than just heme, is he discovered, and if you look at the literature back then, heme was well understood. Heme, which is in hemoglobin or in the blood of a cow, and myoglobin, which binds oxygen and iron. It's an important substance for life. But was not well understood is that we believe heme is the only thing in the world that when you cook it, with simple sugars and proteins and fats. It's the only thing that can make a cow turn itself into delicious beefiness. It's the only thing that creates all of those molecules that convey smell and taste of meat. And it's not just true with beef. It's also the only thing in the world that can make a pig turn into a delicious pork or chicken into chicken, because at lower concentrations with different inputs, it produces the cacophony of flavors and smells that those of us who enjoy eating meat recognize, almost in an instinctual way. And because we believe this problem is so urgent, we felt that we had to have the same source of craveability for the meat eater. And we found it naturally occurring in a plant. Pat found it naturally occurring in a plant with his team. He found it in everything. He just found it particularly abundant in the roots of a soy plant. But we all know that ripping up soy plants during the season and processing them does no good for the environment. And frankly, as the CFO, isn't particularly attractive from a financial standpoint for our sustainability. So we turn to the age-old, reliable method of production that's been in place for decades, which is industrial fermentation. In the same way that a lot of hard cheeses are curdled through a substance called rennet, which, by the way, is a digestive enzyme that's found in the guts of young mammals. Well, the cheese industry doesn't rip and open the guts of young mammals at scale. They use the same technology we do to genetically change an organism and have self-replication of fermentation produce massive amounts of it at a fraction of the environmental impact, and we believe eventually at scale to make us cost competitive. Here's why you shouldn't be afraid of heme. We've all been eating it forever. We've been eating it in animals. We've been eating it in plants. The heme we use naturally occurs in a plant. And we sought the highest standard of food safety and received it years ago, which is to become generally recognized as safe. When I was at Del Monte for 9 years, and I ran their food business, I never went to the second step, which is to take a novel substance and get what's called a no questions letter from the FDA. We did that too, and did a tremendous amount of testing because we knew pragmatically innovation would be questioned by those who love food. Yeah. Heme is perfectly safe. We've all been eating it for forever.
So what would you say to those people who question that it's a processed food and challenge that, as well as how the raw materials are grown? Are they grown in a way that's regenerative or not?
Yeah, I mean, bread is a processed food. Think about how you make many of the foods you consume. I'm
not a big fan of bread, but
yeah, okay. I think this notion that innovation doesn't exist in food and should be vilified is not only not true, it's not productive. You've heard the stats. Mm-hmm. If we could all eat whole foods and still have a planet to live on, maybe we would make that choice. But we can't afford not to use every form of technology to solve this problem, particularly a form of technology that's been soothing the food industry for years. So for us, it's about that where I started. It's the urgency of the problem, the need to have impact, and the need to create craveability if you're going to get meat eaters to adopt our product.
Can you share a little bit about the sourcing of the raw materials, how they're grown? Because I think it's really about how we grow food as well as what we grow.
So equally important to the team wasn't just to have a burger that would make for a fine Whopper one day, though that's price of entry to make the change we want. We've been looking at the sustainability of our overall process to source plant-based ingredients and manufacture them. We use a third-party life cycle analysis to fully audit our product. We have others constantly test. In fact, the current Impossible Burger 2.0 is better in almost all ways than the 1.0, but its pedigree isn't bad. 95% less land use for every Impossible Burger a meat eater picks versus a burger from a cow. It uses only a quarter, if that, of the water. It produces an eighth of the greenhouse gases. And more importantly, we picked our supply chain so that it could be scalably and be a very large share of the meat eater market globally. Now, we are straining today because we've seen a surge in consumer demand, not just from new places like Burger King as they announced, but in all 7,000 locations, we've seen more than a 2x increase in demand per location. I think it's because consumers are realizing that there's a better option, and our product got a lot better with the launch of Impossible Burger 2.0. So right now, it's all hands on deck trying to ensure that we can create more and more capacity to meet this demand.
Thank you. That's great. All right, Nicolette, welcome. you're quite a paradox. You're a vegetarian livestock rancher, and you advocate for what we call managed grazing and regenerative agriculture practices to raise animals as a key part of the solution to nutrient recycling, to habitat restoration, to biodiversity, to water conservation, and climate change. You know, when I was, before I went to medical school, I believe it or not, I took a class in agriculture, and I read a book by this guy, Sir Albert Howard, called Soil and Health, and in it he said the whole problem of the health of soil, plant, and humans is one great subject. And your work is really focused on this problem. So why do truly ecological food and farming systems that are good for humans and animals and the planet, what do they look like?
So, first of all, it's not as big a paradox as it might look that I'm a vegetarian and a livestock rancher, because the more I've learned, I started working on this in 2000 when I was hired by Bobby Kennedy Jr. to be the senior attorney for Waterkeeper Alliance, and he asked me to work on livestock production related issues from the environmental side. And I sort of immediately thought, well, this is great. This reinforces everything that I am already believing as a vegetarian. But I really quickly realized that actually there was this tremendous difference between the production systems. And I felt that a component of our work needed to be supporting really good livestock production, because I was visiting farms and ranches and I was reading a lot of reports and looking at a lot of the data, and I saw that there was tremendous environmental, ecological, cultural, and many other forms of benefits where you had well-managed systems versus really problematic, issues, especially on the environmental side, where you had badly done livestock production. So the really surprising part was when I married a rancher and became a rancher myself. But that's when I met Bill Niman through my work, and actually ended up working on our ranch every day, and did that full time for 7 years after we got married. And I started writing books, and I've written 2 books about livestock production. So what I've learned in those 19 years is that there is no simple answer to this question about what's good or bad environmentally, or even on the health and the human diet side. And really, it's not about the cow, it's about the how. And this is really kind of the crux of the whole thing. Nature needs to be our model. Sir Albert Howard talks about this repeatedly, that when we look at nature, we see everything as connected and interrelated. And as the physicist Fritjof Capra has written, he's written a book about systems thinking. He says nothing in nature is linear, only humans create linear machines. In nature, everything is connected. And in fact, when I started writing the Defending Beef book, I thought I was going to be writing all about animals and the impact, the beneficial impact of livestock on the land, and I'd been learning about that for years. And I suddenly realized I had barely understood the role of fungi, and that they are actually a key part of these ecological systems that we need to mirror our agricultural systems on. So in nature, everything is always connected. You have plants, animals, and fungi always functioning together. And so what, to me, the cornerstone of, first of all, we just need a huge mind shift. We have to stop thinking about just spreadsheets and inputs and what kinds of chemicals. And as Gabe Brown, the farmer in North Dakota who practices regenerative agriculture, says, he used to wake up every day when he was doing conventional agriculture and think, what am I going to go out there and kill today? And when he started shifting what he was doing and creating a truly regenerative farm, he began thinking about how he was going to create and support more life and more diversity on his farm. And he's written a book called Dirt to Soil, which is an extraordinary testament to how he did that on his piece of land in North Dakota. But I guess for me, the cornerstone of truly regenerative agriculture, which is good for humans, it produces healthy food, and it's good for the humans who live and work on or near those farms, and it's much better for the animals and the plants that exist in these systems as well, is that you have to have this thinking of it as an ecosystem and think about the interconnectedness and supporting life, rather than so much about conventional agriculture is a pesticide or an antibiotic. It's focused on sort of killing things and trying to get a single output. And when we really try to come up with a truly regenerative model, it's about complexity and interrelatedness. And this is why I believe so strongly in the importance of animals
Yeah.
on the farm and on the plate.
So there are some who say that even managed grazing, regenerative ag practices with animals, release a lot of methane, that they don't necessarily create the carbon storage in the soil that has been reported. How do you manage those conversations?
Well, I think it's really important to note that the methane conversation has been sort of radically oversimplified to the point of
By the way,
idiocy.
most people may not know that about 29% of the methane production on the planet comes from rice cultivation, and it's one of the solutions, not in the top in there, but it's one of the top solutions for drawing down climate is fixing how we grow rice.
Yeah, in fact, I think it was, I can't remember if it was Sierra Club or NRDC, but one of the major environmental groups just a few months ago released a report saying that we've massively underestimated the methane from rice. So it's funny how that gets so little attention, and the meat issue, especially the beef side, gets so much of the attention. But the whole conversation about methane and just the global warming impact in general related to meat really tends to be reduced to very silly sound bites that have very little to do with truly regenerative food production. And I think just a few key points about it. When you look at context, when you keep the animals in the context of an ecosystem, and you look at all of the ecosystem benefits they provide, for example, well-managed grazing actually creates a great deal more vegetative cover and keeps much more moisture in the soil. And there's very good science showing that when you have that type of environment, then you have much more of the methane that's created in that system actually destroyed prior to entering the atmosphere. And there's also good science on the existence of methanotrophs, which are methane oxidizing bacteria, that they're much more present in a well-managed grazing system. So you have offsets from the soil level. There's all kinds of really interesting research on things like dung beetles, and that the presence of dung beetles reduces the methane emissions on a grazing operation. Well-managed grazing reduces for various reasons. Even things like seaweed amendments into the food, it's been shown, research in Australia has shown 70 to 90% methane reduction from cattle when you add that to the feed. So there are lots of different things that are being tried. And 20 years ago, the rice industry was recognizing this as a problem and began to try to address it, and did make some significant strides, although they're still a significant emitter. The cattle industry is doing the same thing all over the world.
So, question to you and Paul: If this sounds great, but the message we often hear is we need our current agricultural production systems to feed the world. That if we do this, it's great, but it's not enough. How would you address that?
Well, I think the food waste point is extremely important. Also, this whole thing of it's not the cow, it's the how. There's this very, again, robust body of information showing from all around the world, agricultural schools like Texas A&M and Michigan State and Ohio State have shown that when you have well-managed grazing, you actually dramatically increase the productivity of that land. So
Talk about Gabe Brown's story. I think that's compelling because he went from traditional agriculture to regenerative, and he
produces a great deal more. Yes, I mean, he's one of the examples, and there's also research from lots of different universities that just compares, for example, how much vegetation is produced. And the interesting thing about the vegetative cover, when you have well-managed grazing, not only do you keep more water in the soil, but you actually, if you have good grazing practices, you have a more diverse vegetation, which has been shown literally from the ground up, from the microscopic level all the way to the macro level, the entire ecosystem will be far more diverse. And in defending beef, I talk about places around the world where grazing was removed because that was thought to be something that would help the land. And there were a whole bunch of really good university-based studies showing that the entire ecosystem was diminished by that, and especially in terms of diversity. You had a much less diverse soil life, you had much less diverse vegetation, and consequently you had less diverse animal life there. So there are all these impacts, and basically it's about understanding all of the benefits and putting it in context. And when you do that, I think the role of animals becomes very clear, that they're essential. We have to improve the way we're raising animals. That's an absolute...
It's not the cow, it's the how.
It's not the cow, it's the how. And I've written, the first book I wrote, Righteous Pork Chop, especially talks about that, really how we need to dramatically improve the way we're raising animals. But they have a sort of an irreplaceable role And we've been talking about fossil fuels. When you have animals in a system, you can actually replace fossil fuel fertilizer with animal-based fertilizer, and that's what much of the world already does.
Thank you. And Paul, how would you address that question?
Well, I mean, Gabe Brown's best quote is, his farm is screwed by weather and industrial farming practices. He's kind of hit bottom. And he goes out and talks to farmers now all over the country about regenerative agriculture, and every one of them he's talking to every other one has a MAGA hat. I mean, he's talking to a very conservative group of people, and farmers are the last to change. And he's kind of Will Rogers-like farmer. And he said, I got tired of signing the front of the check, and now I sign the back of the check. And that just comes right through. It's really not about the complexity that Nicolette is speaking about. It's an extraordinary ecosystem. The most complex ecosystem in the world is 2 square inches of soil. Mm-hmm. The most complex ecosystem in the world. Just talking about oceans, talking about wetlands. There it is. You can just pick it up. And we don't really fully understand it, but we do know that the whole Earth co-evolved. Every grassland, the Serengeti, the Buffalo Commons, every major ecosystem of grass co-evolved with an amazing number of animals. So we know a lot about that prey-predator relationship and what it does. Mm-hmm. And what we're seeing is a revolution now in farming about no-till, about diverse cover crops, about very complex rotations. Mm-hmm. And there's just a wealth of discovery going on right now about it. How do we feed the world? Well, the first way we feed the world is stop making food like substances and calling it food. Mm-hmm. And we're killing people. We're killing our children.
Mark, can I offer a comment?
Yes.
Well, can I finish?
Sure.
Thank you very much. Because I was going to say about what you said, which is you made a very important point, which is about urgency. And there's 2 things that are important here, urgency and agency. And urgency is, let's get this shit done.
Yeah.
Okay.
On that, we absolutely agree.
I'm still agreeing with you. And agency is people making the right choice, individuals or small groups. And we need both of those if we're going to solve this problem. And one of the things we need is the food industry to stop committing crimes against humanity, which is what it's doing when it convinces our children to soft drinks and Cheetos and other food. This is a crime. This is not kindness. This is not good. And so thank you for what you're doing.
Yes. One point. First of all, I love, Mark, where you started, which is we all are trying to solve this problem. We all have the positive intent. But given the seriousness of the problem, when we disagree on how to do it, I just want to make sure that voices are heard.
Yeah.
So this reminds me, this is about the power of really big numbers. So cows are 10x the biomass of all vertebrates that are wild on the planet today. They significantly impact a number of the solutions on this page. They're one of the biggest threats to biodiversity. Over the last 40 years, it's well documented by authorities far better than me, the impact of animal agriculture on these same solutions we're talking about. If you look at the rainforest itself as a microcosm, you would find that animal agriculture is the biggest threat. So I welcome all of us trying to solve the problem, but we have to be realistic about the magnitude of the solutions we're talking about and how some of them do come at the expense of the big game changers that we are going to need.
Yeah.
And I leave it to those who really know, like Pat Brown and others here about the specific statistics. But even if we quibble about plus 20, 30% of every statistic, it is an undeniable truth that we have to make a massive change on the impact of animal culture on the environment.
There's a guy, Jeremy Kohler, who was part of our food leaders meeting yesterday, who has gathered about $12 trillion in investment funds to influence companies all across the food sector to eliminate factory farming, using investors who were investing in these companies to force them to change their behavior about how they raise animals with antibiotics, with factory farming, which I think is a great lever. So exactly to your point.
But it is not about the cow, it is about the how. That I have to come back with that, because when you look at the best regenerative agricultural systems, they all have animals. So stripping animals out of our food system does not improve ecosystems or biodiversity or anything else. In fact, the UN report, The Livestock's Linked Shadow, which is often quoted by people who don't like meat, even said biodiversity is benefited by the presence of animals in the food system. So, I mean, that's something that most people do agree
We
on.
wouldn't have fruit without animals. Right, every type of fruit co-evolved with different animals to help
Eat the seeds and
And they
spread
drop
spread the seeds around.
That's great. All right, we have like 3 minutes. I'd love to get a couple of audience questions.
Not very many questions, but
I think there was someone in
Right
the
here.
back.
Right here. Oh, sorry.
We have microphones.
quickly.
Runners, maybe? Okay. All right. We have one person in the front yell and then one in the back.
Wait.
Oh, wait.
To change the heme. Hi, thank you all. Oh, sorry.
Wait, maybe
So I was just
Let's
gonna
just
ask,
we'll get the microphone to you
hand it
after.
over there.
'Cause I think nobody
You
heard
can
your
repeat the
question.
question.
I was just going to ask each of you to talk about the economics of your proposals, both at scale and also right now. Thank you very much.
So the question for those who didn't hear is, what are the economics of all these proposals and ideas?
I want to
Yeah.
start, which is that we map, measure, and model the 80 solutions, 20 are coming attractions, and the net gain over 30 years is $74 trillion. And in other words, it's a no-brainer. And the thing that to kind of stop some of the polarization here is that we have to look at this as a system. And it's a system that's causing global warming, and it's a system that will heal it. And that system does not mean we maintain the stocking rates that we do right now, which are insane. I agree with you. Couldn't be worse. It means rainforest protection. It means indigenous people's land management support who are protecting the forests, the amazing primary forests of this world. And so I think we can agree, actually, that rapid and severe reduction in this mindless use of ruminants, mostly cattle, on public lands, on lands that used to be forested and so forth. At the same time, land co-evolved beautifully if animals are on it in a way that honors the animal and the place. And so both are true.
So everybody keep their answers short. We have 1 minute.
Real short. Waste impacts everyone in the supply chain, and by reducing that waste, our products can actually be paid for by grocers, and they can sell them for lower cost at the store.
And what was it? $2.6 trillion would be saved if we didn't waste food.
It's massive.
And I would just say the quote about Gabe Brown signing the different side of the check when he started doing regenerative agriculture really says it all for regenerative agriculture. The biggest draw right now within the agricultural community towards these kinds of practices is because people are showing that they're making a much better living. So it's really a matter of helping that message spread and helping people learn how to do it.
One quick point is we don't believe in subsidies or regulation to achieve our mission, which means we have to power it with our own gross profit margin. And the technology was designed, the brand was created so that we have to be cost advantage for every delicious piece of meat or dairy that a meat eater picks.
And Gabe Brown would agree with you 100%.
And the
he
good news,
thinks the farm bill is horrible for farmers.
and the good news is we don't need new technology anymore. And we've now demonstrated product market fit. I couldn't say that a couple of years ago. The only thing we need to be funding our own sustainable profitability is scale, which we're working on.
Well, I think that it sums it all up. We want to be not signing the front of the check anymore. We want to sign the back of the check. And I think that's what these solutions will help us do. Thank you all for great discussion, conversation, and thank you for showing up.